I'm Wafiq from SMU Islamic Business and Finance Society. So before we actually begin everything now, we can start by recitation of Al-Fatiha for some barakah, and then we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ease our understanding of whatever knowledge that is going to be gained over the next hour or so. So Al-Fatiha. Okay, then we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the opportunity to learn and seek knowledge, to seek knowledge and to learn more about fiqh in Fiqh Muamalat, which is very important in our daily lives, and it will help us to actually run our lives following the Sharia as well. So without further ado, I would just like to thank every single one of y'all for signing up for the event and coming to grace the event on a Friday evening and putting time aside to come and seek knowledge over here with us on the Zoom platform today. So also, I'd just like to put it out there, if you guys have any friends who are very interested in the session, they can just start joining the WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group link has been already, it's actually on the Google form, on the tiny URL form, which you see on the screen on the bottom right. So once they sign up for the event, they can actually just join in from there, and they'll be automatically added into the WhatsApp group where they can post updates and whatsoever. So on the side note as well, we would like you guys to follow our Instagram at SMU IBFS as well as FSAC_SG for regular updates on the events and future events that we might be holding together as well. So without further ado, I'll proceed the second session. So today we actually have Dr. Hazik with us, who will be talking to us about the fundamentals to the Islamic economic system. So let me give you a brief introduction of Dr. Hazik. Dr. Hazik is actually a multi-skilled professional with substantial and varied experience in strategy, technology, and operational leadership roles. His PhD in Islamic finance focused on behavioral research and decision-making analysis using game theory. Currently, he's working on business growth strategies for startups as well as various consulting projects. His past corporate clients include the ASEAN Secretariat, National Finance Officers, as well as the UNCDF. So Dr. Hazik is also the published author of Belief and Rule Compliance on behavioral investigations between economic systems, blockchains, fintech, and Islamic finance, on how technology can fortify financial inclusion, sustainable development, as well as socio-economic advancement. So today's second lesson will actually be on the fundamentals to Islamic economic system, where Dr. Hazik will be covering and sharing with us more about the fundamentals of economic axioms of conventional versus Islamic economics. And he'll be diving into the details to give us a clearer idea of how different is it actually the conventional versus the Islamic economics. So without wasting any time, I'll just hand over the time to Dr. Hazik to take over from here for the session. So before we actually proceed, right, after the hour, the Dr. Hazik will be having his talk for about an hour or so. After that, we will open the floor for a Q&A session. So the Q&A will be held on Slido. The link has actually been sent to the WhatsApp group, and the key has been sent to the WhatsApp group as well. So you guys can actually start posting your questions there from now up till later when the Q&A begins, and then we will just slowly later, inshallah, we will try our very best to answer every single one of it if time permits. So without further ado, I'll just pass it on to Dr. Hazik to take over from here. Dr. Hazik, Bismillah. So I already passed you you are able to share your screen with the session.
Let me share the screen.
Lagi melu meeting iki kok nek ana
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, Ustaz, we can see clearly very well.
Okay, cool. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for that kind introduction, Wafiq. And thank you to SMU IBFS for allowing me to speak on the second lesson of this six-part series on Fiqh Muamalat. So today is the second lesson, and I'll be touching on the fundamentals of the Islamic economic system. I'm sure a lot of people are curious about the difference between an Islamic economic system when we compare it to our existing conventional economic system. What are the differences, and how is it supposed to function? How much of it is the same? How much of it is different, and things like that. So today I'll be speaking about this topic for about an hour, and then we'll open the floor for about half an hour's worth of questions. I think it's better that way. I prefer actually more questions, but because of the nature of the topic, I basically need about 1 hour to cover as much as I can. Because when you talk about an economic system, particularly when you are trying to compare the two, a conventional and an Islamic, we have to have some kind of time so that we can touch on at least the most important or key features of both economic system and what's different between them. Okay, so this will be an overview of today's talk. First, we need to understand the difference between the Sharia and what fiqh is. I think it needs to be made clear about the distinction. This distinction is very slight, but nevertheless, we need to make that distinction so that when we start something, we always, we fortify the fundamentals, then we can move forward easily without being distracted or misunderstanding the concepts from then on. Okay, then after that, we'll cover the contemporary Islamic finance services within the Islamic economic system, because finance is a subset of economics. And then we'll also touch on the key Islamic commercial contracts. This one we have to do so because essentially before you broach the Fiqh Muamalat topic, you have to understand the usul fiqh first, right? We will clear out the usul fiqh understanding on the Sharia and fiqh, and then after that we move into Fiqh Muamalat, which is basically the study of Islamic contracts or financial transactions. Then after that we can start talking about the economy. Okay, so then we'll move into the macro view of the economy. And then we look at the fundamental economic axioms of the conventional system versus the fundamental axioms of the Islamic system. And then we compare the two worldviews of the Islamic worldview and the conventional worldview of what the economic model of man is. And then we'll go into the rules of economic behavior that we have extracted from the Quran and Sunnah. Okay, and then finally, I will finish there, and then you guys decide at the end of this presentation, this hour-long presentation, whether Islamic economics is capitalistic or socialistic, or is it a hybrid, or is it something else. Okay. Okay. So before we go into Sharia and fiqh, I just would like to take a step back and explain something to get us started. When we look at the term Islamic economics, right, or Islamic finance, we have to understand that there is an Islamic portion and then there's the economic portion. If we're talking about the Islamic economics or Islamic finance, there's the Islamic portion and there's the finance portion. So ideally, when we speak or when someone considers themselves to be an expert in Islamic economics or Islamic finance, they have to be expert in both sense. Okay. So for today, we'll start with the Islamic portion first. Okay. The chart that we see before you is, I think, useful chart when I was starting on my PhD journey. Because like most of you, I'm from Singapore and went through the Singapore system. So we know that the Singapore system is a very secular system. So any religious knowledge or training we had to do on our own outside of the national education system, where we had to enroll in madrasa and things like that to learn, about our religion, how to practice, how to pray, how to learn the du'as and the rules and everything else about the Sharia, right? So when I started my PhD journey, which was in Islamic finance, and I did it at INSEF, an institution that was started by the central bank in Malaysia, I realized that instead of having two worlds, right, the living a secular world and then having to learn the Islamic portion through madrasa is like living two worlds, right? The program was designed that it combined those two worlds together, right? So during that time, this chart actually helped me a lot because it gave me a very clear snapshot about what we are trying to study and what we are trying to achieve without claiming to be more than what we are studying. So if you look at the green and the orange boxes, right? So this is the path that we are taking through the 6-parter series and in today's talk. Okay. So essentially, everything starts from the Sharia, because the Sharia is, by definition, the divine laws that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, the Creator, has imposed on us or has declared on us, right? So they are divine laws. So when you talk about something divine, it is very difficult to say from a human standpoint that we understand exactly what the Creator means through his divine laws, right, which is the Sharia. So our understanding of the Sharia is called the Fiqh, right? So if you look under Sharia, we have Aqidah, which is faith and belief, and then we have Fiqh, which is the human understanding of what we think Allah wants us to do through the divine laws. And then we have the akhlaq, which is the morality or mannerisms, how you behave, and things like that. Okay, so today we'll be just talking about fiqh. Okay, we won't touch about akidah and we won't touch about akhlaq because these two are two big bodies by themselves that should have their own track and be taught in their own way. Okay, and then below fiqh you have ibadat and then you have the muamalat. So ibadat is basically meant to God worship. And this is quite related to Aqidah, although it's under fiqh, essentially because this is the vertical relationship between us and our maker. Okay, vertical relationship. So when you look at muamalat is the horizontal relationship between man to man. That means between human to other humans, as well as the environment and everything else that's created. Okay, so then under muamalat, we have three categories, which is the political, economic, as well as the social. Okay, so today we are just going to focus on the economic activities, which is under muamalat. Okay, so this is the path that we are embarking on, right? Okay, now we see what's the difference between Sharia and fiqh. Okay, this is another good framework or diagram which I gained a lot by just looking at the graph, right? At the flow chart, right? It's because this is actually what usul fiqh is all about. So traditionally, when we study fiqh muamalat or usul fiqh, right? Before fiqh muamalat, you have to have the basic foundation, which is the usul fiqh. Usul fiqh means the root of the deen, right? Usul, right? Usuluddin is the root of the deen. Usul fiqh is the root of the fiqh, right? The human understanding of the divine laws. So basically, the divine laws or the sources of the Sharia are the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay, the Quran and the Sunnah. These are why we categorize that way Sharia and fiqh is because Sharia is indisputable, right? Because they are divine. you cannot say it's wrong, because it is divinely inspired and has been brought down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay, through whatever channels, right? But it is divine. So it is perfect in its nature. So the Quran is essentially the message, and a few other things. But basically, what the Quran covers are the prescriptions through the divine laws, the prescriptions, proscriptions, and the declaration, right? So prescription is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want us to do. Proscription is what He doesn't want us to do, like riba and no drinking, no gambling, and all that stuff, right? And then a third of the last third of the Quran is a declaration, right? So it will be stories about prophets, and then it's just a declaration that He wants to transmit the message to us, okay? And then another part of the Sharia is also the Sunnah. So Sunnah is basically the operationalization through a human being of what the message is about, okay? Because sometimes, like for instance, in the Quran, you cannot find how to take wudu, right? Right. So although the Quran encompasses everything, the operationalization of Islam in itself, right, is manifested through a human being. So this is through Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, through his actions and his words. So Sunnah means both his actions as well as Prophet's words. Okay. Hadith means only his words, right? So Sunnah is wider because it includes his actions. So these two together, right? Quran and Sunnah is like our SOP for us to be not only a Muslim but a human being to follow the Sharia. Okay. Below that, you see ijtihad, and then you see ijma, you see qiyas, you see istisan, istisla, and uruf, and a few more. But this is generally what's agreed from the four mazhabs, is the fiqh. Okay. So below that is the human understanding of what the Quran and Sunnah is about. Why does this come about? This comes about because as the world evolves, right, we need scholars to help us decode what the Quran and Sunnah is trying to tell us, especially when we are no longer living in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? The world has modernized, things have changed a little bit or a lot, and we need scholars of the religion to help us decode certain things to determine whether it's permissible or not. So Islam works on the principle of permissibility. So everything is permissible except if it is deemed impermissible through the Quran and Sunnah, right? So we have the 5 categories, right? The wajib, the haram, the makruh, the sunnah, and the mubah, or what we Malays call it as harus. So these are the different categories of permissibility. Okay. So now we come back to fiqh and the ijtihad. So what is ijtihad? Ijtihad is actually a legal reasoning within the fiqh sphere. Okay. So how scholars, right, the mujtahids or the imam or the different scholars of different levels of the religion, right, how they think about how to pass a fatwa or something like that to say something is permissible or not permissible. There are several categories. First is ijtihad. So they do it by there are very deep rules about how you can do ijtihad. So it's not simply reasoning. They have to follow a certain ritual, and then they have to put their thought into it until they become very tired thinking about this one particular question or one particular dilemma to solve. Okay, so that's one category. Second category is ijma. Ijma is essentially a consensus between many scholars coming together when there's a question that's posed by the public. Let's say all the scholars agree that, okay, this should be permissible. So then if that is the case, then that's called ijma. There's a consensus among all the scholars. But of course, there are many cases in the world where there are no consensus on certain things, right? So then we move on to another category where there is qiyas. Qiyas is like an analogy, right? Where if there was a question that's posed to the scholars and there is no direct answer for that particular question, they usually use an analogy if it fits the criteria to make a decision on it. Okay, that's a decision through qiyas or analogy. And then you have istisan, which is a preference or discretion. This is up to the knowledge of the scholar to decide if there is this particular problem where there is no ijma, ijtihad doesn't bring about a conclusive decision, neither does qiyas, then it's up to the discretion of the scholar. Of course, there's a heavy responsibility, right? So they understand that, and then if they decide based on their discretion, it's said that it's decide on istisan. And then you have a decision that's also made under the category of istislah. Usually this is for something like when somebody says for the greater good, right? Or what we say as maslahah, the public good, okay? And then lastly is uruf, where you make a decision based on culture. Why uruf? We allow to make permissibility of religious rules based on culture is because we cannot deny that Islam has spread. Islam came down as a mercy to mankind, not as a mercy to only Muslims. And when you look at the Muslim community, we are actually a very diverse community. We are not homogeneous. We are very, very heterogeneous, right? So when you have a very varied group of people, we grew up with different upbringing, we grew up in different parts of the world, hence we grew up in a different culture or setting or things like that. So because Islam is meant to be as a way of life, right? So the only way to do that effectively is to somehow be able to assimilate within the context of the people that you are reaching out to. So uruf becomes like a very important criteria in terms of religious reasoning and religious law. Okay, so it can be decided for you know, based on cultural purposes. Like for instance, if you go through usul fiqh classes, your ustaz or your mufti or whoever is teaching the class, they would probably tell you that there was a case where, you know, in North Africa, basically they follow the Maliki mazhab, right? Maliki school of thought. So when Imam Shafi was the student of Imam Maliki, right? So basically when you know, people travel and wanted to ask, or when Imam Shafi traveled to that area of the world, right, in North Africa, and then when they asked him to give to decide on a certain particular thing that involves religious law, he being a Shafi, because he's Imam Shafi, right, would say that, okay, because you guys are Maliki, you follow the Maliki mazhab. So that's a decision by a Shafi based on uruf to follow the Maliki mazhab, because essentially the area are people who follow the Maliki mazhab. So Islam is so inclusive that you know, when I started studying, there was always a question like, you know, if Islam is united, why do we have 4 mazhab? Actually, we have more than that, right? You have the Zahiri and Yazidi and all this, but the 4 main schools of thought are the main schools of thought are the four mazhabs. So why do we, if we are united, why do we have differing opinions in these 4 schools of thought? We have that because for the very fact that Islam is inclusive, okay? And why we have 4 schools of thought is because we are open to, you know, opinions or scholarly decisions based on multiple categories. And if it is sound, it will develop into its own school of thought. Of course, the criteria is quite tight, right? But essentially, we have many views because we are essentially inclusive and open to multiple views. Unlike what the media is always trying to portray, right? Because they're always trying to portray the ISIS guys and all these guys which are essentially non-Islamic, because they are very narrow in their thinking and very narrow in judging over people and rules and passing out laws and things like that. So what is Islamic is being open, provided you follow certain rules, right? So of course the Sharia always supersedes the fiqh, the human decisions, right? Because the Sharia is the divine law. Okay, then next we move on to the contemporary Islamic financial services. When we talk about Islamic economics, the subset is always Islamic finance. And essentially when we talk about Islamic finance, this is what we cover. There's a little bit more, but I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot so that you have a logical progression of understanding, right? You move parts by part, because you guys are not bachelors in Islamic finance or masters in Islamic finance or PhD in Islamic finance. So I have to start from the beginning and we progress as slowly as we can. But by the end of the hour, you will probably cover the PhD stuff. So just bear with me for a while. So we have essentially what Islamic banking is, and then we have the Islamic capital markets, and then we have takaful, which is essentially insurance, right? Islamic insurance is called takaful. So under Islamic banking or finance, you have financing, and then you have the deposit and investment, or deposit, what we call as a wadiah. Okay. And then under the Islamic capital market, we have the equities market, which is essentially the stock exchanges and things like that. But because if it's Islamic, it has to be screened according to Islamic requirements, and you know that it's not, if the companies that are listed, you know, if they're borrowing, it shouldn't be interest-based, and, you know, they shouldn't be dealing with alcohol or pornography or pork and all that stuff, right? And then below, after that, you have the bond market, or what we call as the sukuk market. So this, simply, people try to equate sukuk as an Islamic bond, but when you look at the structure, technically, it's more of like a hybrid type of financial instrument. It's not really like a bond, because bond is a debt instrument. Sukuk is more of an asset-backed type of instrument, which is what makes it financially stable, and these are one of the benefits over the conventional bond instrument. Okay, and then we have the takaful, which is the insurance market of within the financial market. And then you have the re-takaful. So it's like, you know, insurance and reinsurance. So if you see, like, we are sort of like trying to mirror what the conventional instruments are, you are not wrong. It's just that because the conventional system has been around for 500 years, and Islamic system is just making a revival in the last 50 years. So whoever has the precedence tend to dictate what is already there. And then the new guys, when they try to compete in every sector. And then we try to sort of like Islamicize the different sector. And then that's why you see that the sectors almost look quite similar. But actually, in substance, we should be quite different. So there'll be people, when I talk about Islamic banking and finance, you know, we'll be arguing until the cows come home, because, you know, there'll be people who say, no, this is totally un-Islamic, even though you call it Islamic banking and finance, and then another person is trying to justify based on being new and still evolving. We are not, although we are not purely 100% Islamic, we are trying to make our way there. So there's multiple views. We are open to everything, but we have to always intend to achieve the 100% goal or 100% purity of being truly Islamic, right? So, but being only 50 years old compared to a 500-year giant, we have to start somewhere. Okay, I think that's the most PC way or democratic way to put it. And then now we move to what traditionally we call as Fiqh Muamalat, which is studying the Islamic commercial contracts. So if you read the Quran, the longest verse in the Quran is verse 282 of Surah Baqarah, chapter 2. So if you look at that verse after this, or you already know, it basically says that if you have a debt, you put it into writing, right? So essentially that verse, Allah is telling you that when you go into an agreement, whether it's for debt or whatever, you put it in writing and you put it as an agreement. So what is an agreement is essentially what we call it as a contract, right? Whether it's verbal or written or whatever, right? But Allah wants us to write it down. And then Allah says in Surah Ma'idah chapter 5, first verse, He says, fulfill all contracts. Okay, so you write it down and then you have to fulfill the obligation of writing the contract. Because if you don't fulfill it, there's no point writing it down. So essentially, this is what Allah is trying to tell us to do. And then we, the scholars, the human beings, come up with Islamic finance as a study, Islamic economics as a study, to try to perpetuate this. So essentially, whether you call yourself, a madrasa or a professor or whatever, whether you're speaking from economics, you have a PhD, or you go to Al-Azhar, or you are someone like me that goes to Islamic finance institution or whatsoever. Essentially, what we are trying to do is the same as what your parents and your religious teachers have been telling you since you were young. Is basically to follow what Allah says because it's good for you. Because when the Creator creates something, He knows what's best for the creation. It's essentially like you buying a microwave and then you are reading the manual, right, to get the most out of your microwave. So essentially the 4 books, right, not only the Quran is the final chapter of the can be seen as the final chapter if you look at all 4 books as one book with 4 chapters, or 4 separate books. The final edition is the Quran. Essentially, the message has always been the same, right? You worship one true God and you listen to what He tells you to do, and your life should be okay. Your life and your hereafter should be okay. So essentially, the message is all the same. So coming back to this specific Fiqh Muamalat, which is the study of commercial contracts, right? You have this different type of contracts up here. You have the gratuitous contract, which is gift, or Arabic term is hiba, wakaf, which is a perpetuity, right? Wakaf, the special thing about wakaf is in perpetuity, right? So essentially, you are giving up your rights to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So He watches over it. So the mutawali, right, the guy who takes care of the wakaf has to protect the so that the asset or whatever it is perpetual, right, until the end of time, right? So that's the benefit of wakaf and the importance of wakaf and the responsibility of the guys taking care of the wakaf. And then you have the loan, which is qard, Q-A-R-D in Arabic, right? So in Islam, you don't make money from loan, right? It's qard. That means you loan 100, you take back only 100. There's no interest, no extra, no nothing, right? And then if you forgive the loan, the qard becomes a qadrul hasan, a beautiful loan, right? Hasan means beautiful, so it becomes a beautiful loan. And then ibra is what we call as rebate. And then you have the trading contracts, you have the leasing, or what we call as ijara, and then you have the sale, what we call as buy. So under the leasing, you have the operational lease or you have the financial lease. So this one, in the study of Fiqh Muamalat, we go deep into the, who's the beneficial owner, who's this, who's that. It moves more into Islamic law and Islamic legal tradition and things like that. So we don't have the time to go deep into that, but I want to paint you a rough picture because maybe there are lawyers or whoever, Islamic law people who are interested. So these are the stuff that Fiqh Muamalat traditionally covers. And then under sale or buy, you have this BBA. BBA is a very controversial contract that was started in Malaysia, but in the GCC in the Middle East, they consider this contract not a valid contract, used for mortgages. And then after that, after several years, you have this dispute, and once a dispute happened, then you start to see when people start lawyers argue over the contract, right, then you start to see how strong the contract is. So if you did not follow the Sharia, your Fiqh assessment wasn't strong, right? Because Fiqh is the understanding of the Sharia, it wasn't strong, and you create some kind of weak type of contract like the BBA. When it comes to default, you will see this kind of problems. And now BBA is being slowly, phased out in Malaysia. Because why it cannot disappear overnight? Because when you talk about mortgages, right, it's like 30 years, 25 years. So it takes time to phase it out. So they're now being replaced by either a ijara, a lease contract, because some people now view mortgages as not really ownership. You're just leasing the house. You don't really own the house. So if you view it that way, then your mortgage contract can be an ijara contract. Or you can see it as a partnership between you and the bank, where the bank purchases the house for you. If you view it as an ownership type of contract, so the bank purchases the house for you, and then you slowly buy it from the bank. So that's called a diminishing musyarakah type of contract, a diminishing partnership. That means the homeowner partnership with the bank that buys the property for them, and then they slowly over the course of 25 years or 30 years, depending on the tenure of the contract, that they buy over the house. So you can see it as a lease or as a sale. And then you have the murabaha, which is just a cost plus type of contract. And then you have salam, which is used for agriculture. And then istisna in terms for like a contracted type of, like a manufacturing type of contract. And then you have the investment contracts, which is you have mudaraba, which is a silent partnership, and then musharaka, which is a joint partnership, right? Silent partnership is someone gives you the capital, and then you are the entrepreneur, you manage everything without coming up with the capital. But musharaka is maybe both come out with a little bit of capital and both run the company, right? And then musharaka, the word is like sharikat comes from the word musharaka, right? And you have these other supporting contracts, which is the kafala, which is guarantee, rano, which is like pawnbroking, right? And then hawala, which is debt transfer, wadia. Wadia is like safekeeping, right? Wakala, there's a Malay word wakil, right? So wakala is an agency or like a representative type of contract. Juala is finder's fee. And then mukasa. I think I need to move on because it's 4:40 already. And then okay, once we have that Islamic portion down, then we can come and talk about the economy, right? So Islamic economics, right? So Islamic part is done. So now we move into talking about economics. Okay, essentially this is what overview of what a macroeconomy is. Very similar to the conventional macroeconomy, just that when you look here at monetary policy and fiscal policy, right? So monetary policy is essentially run by the central bank of any country, and then the fiscal policy is run by the Ministry of Finance. So fiscal policy is basically where they collect tax revenues for the government to function, right? So any subsidies or any government programs is basically funded through the tax collection, tax revenues of every country. And then monetary policy is for the conventional system, they have the interest rate level, interest rate mechanism, where they try to control the volume of money, right? So when you want to mop up the excess cash, you increase the interest rate. So how it happens is when you increase the interest rate, people tend to save. So they put money in banks. So you mop out you reduce the liquidity that's out in the market. But if you are going through a sort of like a slight downturn and you want to invigorate the economy, the central bank usually sends a signal to the market by reducing the interest rate. so that people say that, okay, no point saving because interest rate is so low, I take out and I can invest my money outside, which usually goes into the economic sector to invigorate the economy. So the key function here is that in Islam, since we ban interest or riba, what happens is we don't have the interest rate as a mechanism, right? So we don't have the interest rate as a lever in our monetary policy, okay? And then this one in itself, we can spend like 3 hours or a whole class to go through the arrows, right? Which is basically a signal that you send out to the different parts of the economy, the financial sector, the external sector, the private sector, which are the corporations and the households and things like that, okay? And then the financial mobilization that the government uses. For Islam, we try to use a risk sharing type of instrument. That's another concept that we can go deep into, which is different from the conventional sense. Okay, so how different is conventional economics compared to Islamic economics? Okay, so we look at the fundamental axioms of both economic systems. So when you look at the conventional system, essentially everything, their theories and their philosophy and their ideology is centered around these three fundamental axioms, right? Scarcity, rationality, and self-interest. Okay, so the father of modern economics is Adam Smith, right? So, you know, if you're an economics person, you must have heard about this invisible hand and things like that, right? The wealth of nations and things like that. But interestingly, there are different views on, depending on how you learn your economics and how it's taught to you, right? But how it was taught to me is actually the father of economics, Adam Smith, was a moral philosopher before he became the father of economics, before he was deemed as an economist, right? Because if you see the book that he wrote before, what do you call this? The Wealth of Nations, it was the theory of moral sentiments. So if you read that book, you will see a different side of him. He was like a moral philosopher, right? So the way that I was taught, the way I view Adam Smith, is that he wrote the theory of moral sentiment first because he wanted to lay the moral foundation before he started writing about economics. So essentially, when you study economics and when you study Adam Smith, you should be studying the theory of moral sentiments with the Wealth of Nations. So although there are two books, it's almost like you need to be studying both volumes, like as if it's part of one book with two main volumes, volume 1 and volume 2. That's the way I understand it. Okay. So conventional sees it as, you know, scarcity of resources. That's what governs how resources are distributed and things like that. And then they always assume that the economic man is always rational, right? So then now you have a subset of the conventional economics, the behavioral economics guys, who says that, okay, there's a fundamental flaw because human beings are not rational all the time. We are subjected to emotions. We are irrational, actually, a lot of the times. So now you have a subset of conventional economics, behavioral economics, which is my area of thesis when I did my PhD, that sort of like debunks this rationality axiom within the conventional economic system. Okay, so now we move to the Islamic economic system. So when you look at the Islamic economic system, basically it is what Islam is, right? So number one, Tawhid. It's always about oneness of God, right? So there's only one true creator. In fact, we know this, right? Before you go to sleep, if you read Suratul Al-Ikhlas 3 times, it's as if you have khatam the entire Quran, right? That's how important Tawhid is, because Al-Ikhlas is basically the affirmation of one true God, right? So Tawhid is so important that whatever you look into, right, Islamic finance, economics, accounting, whatever this and that, right, this is the key fundamental axiom when we study anything that's related to Islam. Okay, and then number 2 for economics is nubuwah, which is prophethood, and then number 3 is mikat, which is accountability. So accountability, because we always talk about the hereafter, right? We always talk about Jannah and we talk about Jahannam. If you really think about it, right, when we talk about Jannah and Jahannam, this, whether you call it retribution, you call it karma, you call it payback, you call it, what goes around comes around, whatever, right, that governs you in your behaviors, because you know that if I do something right or something wrong, I'm going to go to hell. So that means you don't have to have rules like the government coming after you, or you don't have to have rules placed on external rules, human rules placed on you to govern your behavior. Because of this ultimate accountability, because of the promise of Jannah and the punishment of Jahannam. So essentially, this is what I call as the source of moral behavior. This ultimate accountability axiom that we have under Mikat. Okay, so essentially, from an Islamic perspective, we see scarcity is actually an illusion because of unlimited wants, because of hoarding, because of poor distribution mechanisms, all of which is in contradiction to the teachings of Islam and the laws of the Sharia, right? So we do have shortage of resources in some parts of the world, but essentially, if you follow the brotherhood or the clear understanding of what Islam is, where you help your brother and you don't, let your neighbor sleep hungry and things like that, and you optimize the coordination and the distribution facilities of resource allocation, scarcity won't happen. Because if you read in the Quran over and over again, Allah says that we have created everything as sufficient, right? So from an Islamic perspective, I am from the position that there is no scarcity, okay? And then part of rationality, even behavioral economics is knocking on this rationality axiom because we know that we are not rational all the time. So the Islamic view is that rationality is reason. We see people as they are. That's why we are forgiving towards people who do wrong. We don't chop their heads immediately. We wait for witnesses. We go through a due process and things like that, right? So our rationality is a type of reason type of rationality, because we know that because we are subjected to emotions and things like that, we can become quite irrational at times of our life, which Islam encourages you to overcome your nerves, to overcome your dark self, right? Especially the Sufis, they always talk about polishing the heart and overcoming your nerves, the various levels of your nerves. Okay, and then for us, for Islamic economics, we are not driven by self-interest alone, but also the collective interest, right? So we watch the public interest as well as the personal interest, and we always try to balance both. Okay, but public interest always supersedes a small group interest. Okay, this is essentially what we have covered. So this is another nice table to give you a snapshot of essentially what's different between the Islamic economic system compared to the conventional economic system. Okay, and then we also talk about this. Okay, and then there's another concept that besides the concept of brotherhood is also the concept of Khalifa. Essentially, when we, if you read in the Quran, right, there's a surah and a verse that says that when the angels and the mountains and the other creations were offered to be the Khalifa of the world, they said no, right? But when he was offered to the human being, Adam, he agreed. And then one of the angels told Allah SWT, why would you let a being which is prone to bloodshed and all these things, right, to become the Khalifa of the world? So Allah SWT said, I know what you do not know, right? So that part, right, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that is because although Allah made us the Khalifa, He breathed us into us the role, right? So your soul is actually His deputy, right? The soul that resides within your heart, right? That's why people always say is that look into your heart when you are asked, you know, when you're looking for your passion or you're trying to do something or whatsoever, they always say look within, look into your heart, right? Basically, why look into your heart is that is where your soul resides, right? And your heart is essentially somewhere in the middle of your being, right? So that's like if we were a city, right? The heart is the center of the city of man. So if you can get a book by Ibn Arabi, The Divine Kingdom, the Divine Kingdom of the Human Being, right? He explains that into deep detail, and it's very philosophical and very beautiful the way he actually put it. So although Allah made us the Khalifa, Allah knows of our fallibilities and He made the soul His deputy, right? So no matter how far we go astray, there's always something that's calling us back, right? No matter how bad you are, whether you're a mafia boss or you are the most tattooed gangster whatsoever, right? The distance from you and God, right? No matter how far you think how bad you have become, right? Is nearer than you think, than you can ever imagine, because He says He is closer to you than your jugular, right? So then next we move into the what defines the Islamic economic system, right? So when you look at the Islamic economy as a whole, it is essentially composed by a collection of institutions, right? So whether it's the political institution, the economic institution, or the social institutions that you're talking about, all these institutions, right, are actually just a collection of behaviors, right? When you talk about corporate culture, or you talk about, you know, how this company does this, and you know, how Apple is outstanding because the culture is different, and you know, all that stuff, right? So essentially, it's just, if you look at corporations as institutions and agents, government agencies or whatever agencies as companies as institutions, they are just a collection of behaviors of the employees of that particular corporation or institution. So in order to govern that, what makes them different is they have a code of conduct, right? Even some of you, when you go out to work and so on, you have a badge, and usually at the back you have like a code of conduct, or you know, like a company philosophy or something like that that's printed on your employee card, right? So that essentially wants to govern your conduct, right? So if we view it in that way, from an Islamic economy perspective, what are the rules of conduct for the Islamic economy? So in a book that I've written, and I also covered it in my thesis that we published, we extracted 9 rules, right? There are many other rules, but we essentially extracted the 9 fundamental rules that we think that should govern behaviors when you talk about an ideal Islamic economy, right? And this is drawn from the Quran and the Sunnah, because essentially the divine laws create the meta framework of the Islamic economy. And then Rasulullah SAW is the archetype model that operationalize those intents of this meta framework defined by the Quran, right? So this is, my mentor, who is ex-IMF, who is also Hafiz al-Quran, and where I learned a lot of this from, this is how he has framed it. Because, you know, essentially the sources of the Sharia are the Quran and Sunnah. So he has framed Islamic economics as such. Okay, so the first rule of the 9 that we covered is the rule compliance and discouraging non-compliance, which is the capstone rule. Capstone rule is the rule that encompasses all other rules. So if you read the Quran, there's a term that says Amar bil Ma'ruf wal Nahi bil Munkar, right? enjoin good and forbid evil, right? Always, right? Over and over and over again in the Quran, when you read it, right? So essentially it means to enjoin good and forbid evil, right? Not only to enjoin good, but you must also forbid evil. Because sometimes it's easier to just say, okay, do good, but when you see something wrong, especially when this guy is bigger and he has the potential to hurt you, you sort of like shy away, right? Or for whatever other reasons, right? But the Quran tells you to enjoin good and forbid evil, right? So you have to do both. And then number 2 is the rule of cooperation. The functioning of an economy involves rules of cooperation because in order to enact regulations and secure compliance and accountability within the economic system, there has to be cooperation among institutions involving regulators, agents, and the market players. So this is why the rule of cooperation is very important within the Islamic economy. Number 3, the rule of consultation. So this is a very Islamic aspect, right? Because we always go for shura, right? That's why we have meeting, right? Mashwara, right? Shura, right? We have a meeting because we want to gather everybody's opinion. So this in effect is to effect the rule of consultation, right? The wisdom of crowds, right? We have a discourse, we get everybody's opinion, and then we decide on something. So that's the rule of consultation. And then next is the rule of contract. So this one we covered in Fiqh Muamalat, right? And there's Surah 282 of Baqarah, right? You have to write everything down, and it has to be in a clear agreement so that there's no ambiguity, right? So one of the functions which I'm sure Ustaz Nuzaihan covered in last Friday is the, besides no riba, no maisir, is no gharar, right? So gharar is, here I want to make a distinction. Gharar is not uncertainty. Gharar is ambiguity, specifically deceptive ambiguity, okay? Because in a contract, you don't know what you don't know. So you cannot remove gharar. You can, if gharar is defined as uncertainty, you cannot remove uncertainty. Uncertainty is a creation by Allah SWT to make us rely on Him. So this is if you can view it as a creation, uncertainty is something which nobody can predict. It is only within the within Allah's domain, right? It is not for us to venture in. It is creation. He does whatever He likes with it. So for me, the correct terminology of gharar, right, is ambiguity, specifically deceptive ambiguity. So a contract cannot be ambiguous, right? Unfortunately, I've heard some professors of law unfortunately in Singapore, they proudly say that people pay me the big bucks in their consulting work because they are able to write ambiguous contract that has a backdoor that always benefits their client. So in Islam, that won't happen because we are supposed to do away with gharar, no ambiguity. Our contract is supposed to be simple, very clear, so that there's no ambiguity. And both counterparties understand what is written in the contract, the terms and conditions. So if something happens, there's no argument. Okay? This is what an Islamic contract is supposed to look like, whatever contract it is, gratuitous, investment contract, trading contract, whatever contract. This is, in essence, what our contract needs to be. And then number 5, we have transparency of information, right? Transparency of information because we don't want to have asymmetric information, which is also a subset of gharar, right? So the Sharia acknowledges the market mechanism as a vehicle for the determination of prices. So when we have a transparency of information in the market, the price essentially is set by the market, right? Not artificially set by a monopolist or a group of people who have monopoly over the market, or by the interest rate mechanism. Because if you see everything now, if you're in finance, everything is basically priced based on the interest rate mechanism, right? So in Islam, we don't have an interest rate. So we have what we call a market rate. So in order for the market to function efficiently, we have to have transparency of information. Okay, and here you have the hadith that says, you know, when you there was Sahaba who had two types of debt. One debt was a higher grade, one debt was a lower grade, and then he wanted to exchange one to one like that. And then Rasulullah said, no, you should take the higher grade, go to the market, you know, exchange it for the lower grade, and then you have the one to one exchange with the lower grade. So there is no increase or riba, right? There's a different form of riba, right? So that is essentially what Rasulullah is telling you, is to let the market set the price. For that instance, the two grades of different dates, different grades of dates. Okay, that's the letting the markets set the price. Number 6, we have the rule of property rights. So respecting property rights is very important. Even in the conventional world, there's a guy, Asimoglu, who wrote a book called Why Nations Fail. Essentially, he says that if the world were to go into chaos and there was only one rule that will be upheld to ensure there's some semblance of rule of law, it would be the rule of property rights. Because essentially, you know, if you don't respect somebody's property right, you just go walk over to his place and just take his car or his bike or his tree, or you know, was still his land, right? You know, then there will be chaos. Okay, even in the last sermon of Rasulullah, he iterated this, right? Verily, your blood, your property, and your honor are sacred on you. So number 7 is the rule of reciprocity, right? So you know, when you do good, you expect good. If you expect good, you have to do good. You know, if you do wrong, you know, you can only expect people to come after you. And this is just a basic law of nature, the rule of reciprocity. And we need to behave in such a manner, right? So the rule of reciprocity may be able to address market failures related to mistrust, asymmetric information, and so on. Because if you reciprocate, right, you will essentially increase trust, right? And then the market will be able to function in an efficient manner. If not, it will be prone to failure, what in economics we call as market failure. Okay. And then number 8 is the golden rule. So this one is, I think, quite common through all religions. I wrote a paper on golden rule, and then I extracted basically from Hindu, from Christianity, from Judaism, from even Zoroastrianism, from every religion that you can think about. They agree that you always do unto others as you would have done unto you. Okay, or in Islamic terms, a right of not to harm and obligation of not to harm. Okay, this is our understanding of the golden rule. And then lastly, number 9, of course there are more rules, but here lastly, number 9 is the rule of trust. Trust is a very important factor, intangible factor in, you know, whether it's in economics or doing business or finance or whatsoever, or even in a contractual basis, right? No matter how much terms and conditions you write, right, there has to be some element of trust when you go into a contract with somebody, right? So trust is basically the grease or the lubricant for the economy, whether it's conventional or Islamic. Economies and societies with lower levels of trust tend to be less productive because they are basically spending time doing due diligence and not trusting you, and you know, they are also inundated by stifling levels of regulation because you want to enforce a rules-based system, right? When you have a high level trust in a society like Japan, for instance, or you know, New Zealand or whatsoever, who is the number 1 in the Islamicity Index, right? When you have a very high level of trust, you move towards a principle-based type of economy rather than a rule-based type of economy, right? It's like when you're a kid, right? When you're trying to teach the kid when they're young and they don't know the rules, right? You teach him the rules, so it becomes a rule-based type of parenting, right? Because if not, if you know, don't touch the fire, you know, you'll burn your hand, and it's a rules-based, right? And then you punish him, right? But as he grows older, when he becomes mature, he understands how the world works. He understands the rules. He understands how to respect and, you know, property rights and, you know, all these things. You expect him to do the right thing. So that's a principle-based type of system that you want people to adhere to. So you always start from a rules-based system, and then when the trust levels goes up to a very high level, then you go to a principle-based where you trust people to do the right thing. Okay, as long as cannot be trusted to do the right thing, you always have to fall back to the rules-based system to remind them of what is permitted and what is not permitted. Okay, so for us, in addition to that, we have this concept of amanah, and we want to amanah. That means when Allah made us the Khalifa, there is a amanah, there is a trust that is put upon us, right? To not betray this honor that He has betrayed on us, right? To ensure that we take care of each other, we take care of our environment. You know, we ensure that the resources get to the poorest and the needy and things like that, which is what the UN is also doing through their SDG goals, right? So, yeah. So essentially, this is my hour is up. Yeah. I think I kept time quite okay. So I would like to recommend certain books because in this 1 hour that I cannot cover every aspect of Islamic economics, but I think I have covered as much as I could, especially the key ideas of Islamic economics. If you wish to know more, these are the books which I find very, very useful. There are many Islamic economics books out there written by different types of people, but these 4 books are books which I personally have gained a lot from. Also because they were partly written by people that I know and also by my mentor, right? My mentor spent 24 years in the IMF. He retired as the executive director of the IMF or the dean of the executive board of the IMF. So he's the top tier economist you can ever find, and he's also a Hafiz Al-Quran. So he's one of those rare individuals that's balanced in both areas, right? When you look at the two terms, Islamic and economics. So these are some of the books that he wrote with his friends. This book, The Economic System of the Early Islamic Period, was quite cool. Written by Said Kazim, Professor Said Kazim. If you wanted to know how the Islamic economic system was like in the early days of Islam, he essentially did many years of research to dig that out, and he covers that in the book. And then you have this book, The Ideal Islamic Economy, which is framed in the sense of how this talk is also framed. And then the last book is the book that I wrote with my mentor and his buddy from the IMF, Dr. Nuri Erbas. And then this one we pose the Islamic version of behavioral economics. So essentially it's like Islamic behavioral economics in that last book called Belief and Rule Compliance. So you'll be proud to know that's the picture of Masjid Sultan, since the writer is a Singaporean. So I chose the Masjid Sultan to be my book cover. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'm actually open to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hazik, for the concise, and you covered everything from the basics, which is very good because to help our non-Muslim friends as well understand the basics of Islamic economy, the fundamentals of Islamic economy. Really, thank you for that. Other than that, we would like to end off the session with Tasbih Kafara as well as Surah Al-Asr. Other than that, thank you so much for the session today, and thank you so much, Dr. Hazik, as well. And just, yeah, I have nothing else. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much.